Part 20. Jonathan stepped up, looking at me closely, then took my hand and placed it in his open palm. He looked down at it. You aren't shaking, and your temperature is about normal, or within the range you've stayed in lately. He looked back up at me, his eyes filled with worry. What's wrong? Great. Suddenly I couldn't seem to form words. My entire body and every part of my mind was focused on my hand, or more specifically, on the feel of his hand under mine. I felt my mouth open at one point, but nothing came out, and it finally closed. We need to get her to her doctor's, Track snapped and reached for me. No, I yelped, keeping my hand resting on Jonathan's. I'm good. I'm fine. Track's eyes were tight. No, you aren't, Ray. Okay, I wasn't, but I was also certain that it had nothing to do with shifting. Chapter 13. My dad was in the room when we walked in, and he smiled as he came over. I gave him a small smile, and his dipped just a bit. His eyes moved to Jonathan, who looked at me. She liked the movie, he said lightly. My dad looked back at me, his eyes asking what I couldn't answer, even if I knew how. I nodded. It had really great special effects, I offered, with too little enthusiasm. He frowned and looked past us all to Michael. I didn't turn to see the exchange, but my dad seemed to relax after it. The doctors came towards me and I moaned. I'm starting to feel like a guinea pig. Well, you do have the eyes for it, Track teased, and I wrinkled my nose at him. Do you really have to do this? I asked the gray-haired one. My dad put his hands on my shoulder. I wish I could spare you. You are the boss, Dad. All you have to do is tell them to leave me alone. My dad nodded. Yes, but they're here to help. Great. Guess he wasn't going to lay down the law and tell them to leave me alone. I turned and looked at Jonathan, my need for a hero plainly on my face. He gave a small nod and then looked at my dad. What if we passed on just this one exam? My eyes widened in hope. Track shook his head. If you do that on this one, she'll just... Hey, he yelped when I elbowed him. Dad looked at us while the doctors waited calmly. They had their tools ready and obviously expected my father to stick to his original decision. Sadly, they were right. I sat on the side of my bed while they prodded and poked me. Track and Jonathan stood by, and my dad was again on his cell phone. I felt bad for that. He had called his business trip short to come back because of me, and now he had to try to conduct all his business and take care of me. I watched him, with his back to me, bend over his phone. He gestured wildly with his free hand, and I didn't try to listen. I lowered my eyes and tuned out the things going on around me. A sort of sadness slipped in, tossed in a lot of guilt, and I wallowed in it until they finished up with me. It seeped in deeper as I moved back onto the bed, sitting on top of the beautiful red and gold comforter. All these people were altering their lives because of me. The only ones I didn't feel guilty for were the doctors/scientists. I bet they were thrilled with my new condition. Track rarely ever went back to Polson. When he did leave, it was when I was asleep, and he was always back before I woke up. I knew, because I heard the others talking about it. Jonathan, well, he had to have a life besides this. He had his businesses to run. Beamer's for one, and the other ones I didn't know. My dad even had our staff work harder and change their routine because of my erratic schedule. Ryan, Phil, Jackson, Rock, the Tree Line Pack, all of them shifting their lives around mine. I looked down at my hands. I used to hope for excitement more than anything. I led a life of the guarded heiress of a high vampire. My wolf side had provided me my only escape, and I craved it and hungered for it. I never hunted with them, but my time there had been the most exciting ever. Now, here I was, turning the science world on edge and turning my family and friends into zombies that lived based on my timelines. They were always there for me, always trying to do and say the right thing. They never complained about it, not even the slightest annoyance, yet it had to be so hard for them. I felt my eyes water, and then a tear snuck down and rolled down my cheek. My nose started to run, and I drew in a hard breath. There was still a part of me that wished that the next shift would be the end. Then they could mourn me and move on with their lives. They lived long enough that they would soon get over the pain and be able to put their lives back in order, an order I was shredding. I saw a hand move in front of me, and then my chin was lifted. Jonathan's gray eyes looked at me with such concern the guilt doubled. He wiped my tear away gently. His touch made me shiver a little bit, but it felt nice. "Did they hurt you?" he asked quietly. All I could do was shake my head. I leaned back on the pillow, only sorry that I pulled myself away from his touch. I blinked and a few more tears ran down. My dad walked over and looked at me. Jonathan moved and he sat in his place, his eyes moving over me. He turned and ordered everyone out. They left, the workers quickly, Jonathan and Track reluctantly. When the doors closed, my dad put his hand on mine. "I can't imagine how hard this is for you, sweetheart." I looked up into his dark eyes, my brows knitted. "For me?" I whispered, and he looked confused. "Dad, I am so sorry." "Sorry for what?" I looked around the room. "For this. For everything," I shook my head. "For everyone stopping their lives because of me. For everyone having to sacrifice for me." The tears were coming harder and faster now. "You had to come home early. Jonathan can't run his businesses. The pack should be celebrating the new wolves." He pulled me up and wrapped his arms around me. I pulled my arms in, curled up against his chest, and sobbed hard. He stroked my hair and let me cry, gently rocking me and laying his cheek on the top of my head. I cried until I thought for sure I would run out of the salty water, but somehow I still found more. My body shook from it, and still more came. The pain of it all crashed around me. Guilt, hurt, embarrassment, anger, all of it rushed through me. Finally, the tears did stop. I kept my cheek against a soaked shirt. I wanted to stay right here, in my dad's arms forever. I felt safe here, loved, and I didn't want to move. His arms blocked the world out, and I felt like a little girl again. He squeezed me tightly to him. "We will get through this, Reina. I promise you that." I nodded against him, his voice seeping into me and comforting me. His phone rang, and I pulled back, wiping my face. I looked at his pocket, and he shook his head. "Whatever it is, it can wait." I sighed. "No, Dad, take it. I hate the guilt of all of you putting your lives on hold because of me." It continued to ring. He smiled at me, reaching out and brushing my hair out of my face. "Do you really think so little of us?" I frowned, and he shook his head. "You are my world, Reina. If I had none of this," he gestured outward, "but still had you, I would be the happiest vampire there is. But," his eyes saddened and the phone went silent, "if I ever lost you, none of this would mean a thing." I looked up at him. His dark eyes told me what I already knew. I had an absolutely amazing dad. I swallowed hard. "Thank you. I'm better now. Just a minor breakdown." He relaxed a little and smiled. "When things have settled down, I think we need to take a nice long vacation." We had taken long vacations before, usually when some nosy humans started putting too much information together. I took in a slow, deep breath, then squared my shoulders. He gave a soft chuckle. "No one expects you to hold it together all of the time, sweetheart. This is something that would drive most mad. You are so much stronger than most, and we are in awe of your strength." I flinched. "Strength?" He nodded. "Look at all that you have been through, sweetheart. No one has ever been recorded to have survived even one full shift and back. Yet you have done it dozens of times now, and here you sit worried about everyone else but you." I felt the corner of my mouth twitch in a small smile. He nodded. "You are amazing." Then he shrugged. "But I already knew that." When I looked up at him, he nodded again. "I knew if anyone could make it through this, it would be you." "I'm nothing special," I whispered. "I live in this manor and go to Polson under heavy guard. What have I ever done to make you think I'm so strong?" "Just what you said." Okay, that was confusing. How did being a quiet shut-in prove I was strong? "You live a hard life. Yes, you have many things, but you have to stay within these walls, as you just said. You can only leave under heavy guard. If anyone has guilt for their life forcing someone to do something, it's me. My rank, my job, all of it have forced you into this life, and yet you have never complained." "Much." He chuckled and winked. "You didn't ask to be born part vampire and part werewolf, but you took it all in stride. That takes an inner strength that is rarely seen." Wow. Did dads take a class in this kind of thing? Or was mine just that awesome? My smile cracked a little and I threw my arms around his neck. "Thank you for being so incredible," I smiled. He hugged me back, chuckling. Finally, I sat back and looked towards the door. Those doctors are probably wearing a hole in the rug out there. He shrugged. "So let 'em. We will sit here as long as you want." That was awfully tempting. But I also noticed that he turned his phone off, and I'm sure it had rung several times already. "I'm okay. Thanks for letting me fall apart, and for putting the pieces back together." I stood, and he did as well. It's okay to let him in. The more I wallow, the harder it'll be. "Spoken like a true Beldrin," he said, smiling proudly. When he didn't move, I walked across the room and opened the door. Track was the only one that bolted back in. The others lingered in the hallway a little before slowly coming back. Track walked right up to me and looked me over, his face tight and worried. "I'm fine," I smiled, wiping the last of the wetness off my cheeks. "They need to earn their pay and find a way to stop this," he snapped, glaring at the doctors that ignored him and walked back to their station. "Or I do," I replied. He eyed me and I shrugged, walking towards my bed but stopping just next to it. "Didn't someone mention me learning to control it?" Track's eyes narrowed. "They don't know if that's even possible." I did notice the doctor stopped now. They were listening. "Well, what if it was?" Jonathan walked up and smiled. "If it were possible, you would be the one to figure out how to do it." I smiled at him. For the first time since this started to happen, I turned to the doctors. "Is it possible?" I asked the gray-haired one. He looked at my father, who eyed me, and then nodded slowly. The doctor stepped up. "Well, Miss Beldrin, in theory, it could be possible." Miss Beldrin? Wow, they were way too serious. "What is the theory?" Jonathan and Track moved up to either side of me, and my father was close to the doctor. The man looked at his partner. If you could learn to gain control while you shifted, we think there is a good chance that you could control the change. Control it? Meaning stop it? I asked. That, or even control the shifting itself and thereby control the outcome. I chewed over that information. So, in theory, I might be able to control what parts shifted? Inwardly and outwardly, the dark-haired one said, his eyes dancing with excitement. For instance, you might be able to shift into a wolf form, but retain the abilities of your vampire genes, or you may be able to shift to your vampire structure, yet maintain some of the wolf. And what exactly would be the benefits of that? I asked, crossing my arms in front of me. Think of the limitless possibilities, the younger-looking vampire said, moving closer, his eyes dancing with excitement. You might even be able to change into your vampire form and yet still walk in the sunlight. Ah, there it was. The one thing all vampires hope for, yet had never been able to achieve. There were special suits that were made, but they were so expensive and so ghastly they were not often used. The branch that hunted dangerous hybrids had them, but other than that, there were very few vampires that had one of those hanging in their closet. I blinked a few times. How would I be able to control it? The pain is... I glanced at my dad. Well, I can't think during it. The two doctors moved closer to me, slowly though. If you can learn to sense the shift before it happens, you can mentally prepare yourself, the gray one said. I realized I really needed to find out their names, so I asked. The gray-haired one was Dr. Johann, and the younger, blonde one was Dr. Wilmay. I nodded. So, learn to see the signs as early as possible. They both nodded, and I shrugged. Okay, that's at least a start. Track turned to me. How about a swim? I looked at my dad, and he nodded. Track clapped his hands together. All right, then, you walking or riding? Walking, I stated quickly. Jonathan came with us, and I noticed that Michael had another partner now. This one was nearly as large as he was, and had the same coloring. Kind of creepy, like a mini Michael, but he seemed nice. His name was Martin. I changed into my suit and saw Paige by the pool when I walked out. I waved and she smiled back. Then I noticed she was in a suit too. Great, more work. I looked for Track and glared at him. He shrugged to show he didn't know either, and I sighed. Jonathan walked up behind me. I heard and smelled him before he got there, and I turned. Was this your idea? I almost hissed, then stiffened, not meaning to snap. No, it wasn't, he stated, not reacting to my bark. We both walked towards the pool, and I glanced down at him. He was in swim trunks, and once again, they matched my suit. How did he do that? He chuckled, but stepped up in front of Paige. Reina came here to play, he stated. I stopped next to him, watching Track throw in the pool toys. Of course she did, and I have no intentions of stopping that, she smiled. I'm just here to play lifeguard. Just what I need, another protector, I mumbled, then started. What was wrong with me? I shrugged. I just meant that with the others here. She was still smiling. Your father's orders, I'm afraid. Don't worry. I won't hover. You go have fun. I looked over to where Michael and Martin were standing, my twin walls. Michael smiled and Martin mimicked him. Okay, that was creepy. When I turned back to the pool, Track was diving in the deep end. Jonathan leaned towards me. How about we start at the other end and work was all he got out. I stomped over to the pool, suddenly irritated at his comment. Then I pushed off and dove into the deep end. The water hit me, and I felt the coolness slap me. It was an odd feeling myself to have to hold my breath. It didn't hurt, and I could have held it for well over a minute, but the sensation was still new. I reached the bottom and pushed up. When I shot out of the water, I saw Track directly in front of me. "Don't you dare lecture me," I hissed. He was resting his chest on a kickboard and grinned. "I wasn't planning on it, Moody." I huffed and reached out, grabbing hold of the board and tipping it. He went over laughing. Vampires and werewolves both have fast reflexes, but vampires are a bit faster. We can move so fast that it can't be tracked with others' eyes. I rarely use that ability. Lack of need, I suppose. But it's nice to best him at something. I gasped and was pulled under. Track's face grinning in front of me, his dark brown hair floating around his head. My jaw tightened, and for a split second I wanted to reach out and... The thought made my skin crawl, and I surfaced looking around. I swam quickly to the side and pulled myself up. What was wrong with me now? I ignored Track's calls and took a few steps further away, wrapping my arms around me. He called me again, his voice closer this time. "Please stay away," I thought. "I don't want to say anything I'll regret." I felt the anger creeping up again. I heard him walking closer. His footsteps seemed to pound on the tile, although I knew they weren't. As he reached out to touch me, I whirled around, my eyes tight, and he gasped and took a step back. I blinked hard and shook my head, then put my hands on the side of it and closed my eyes to force back the strange thoughts that were trying to surface. "Knock it off," I thought. "Get control of yourself. Track is my best friend. I have to get control." I shook a bit and struggled, but finally got the images that danced in my mind to vanish. I shivered again and then opened my eyes. Track, Jonathan, Paige, and Michael were standing in front of me. I looked down quickly. "Sorry. I'm okay now." "What happened?" Jonathan asked, looking from Track to me. Track replied first. "When she looked at me, her eyes, they were completely black." We all looked at him. His eyes were on me. Just for a split second, your eyes, all of them were jet black, Ray, and I felt... He shivered, and I lowered my gaze. Paige's body language was as careful as always. She looked at Jonathan. Vampires' eyes turn black, even the whites when... He nodded, his voice quiet. "When we are in bloodthirst." I moaned and turned sideways. Bloodthirst is a term used when a vampire went too long without feeding. They became a bit crazed, and their vampire persuasion would kick into high gear. The blackened eyes would freeze a human or lesser race into submission. It rarely had much effect on a high-ranking wolf. The only other time it happened was when a vampire was fighting mad. Not just pissed off, I mean ready to shred you into tiny pieces mad. Jonathan looked at Track, and my best friend shook his head. "I didn't imagine it. You don't imagine that look. I can still feel it." He shivered and rubbed his hands up and down his arms. I'd never used my vampire persuasion. There had never been a need. The same was even truer for the only other reason for the vamp eyes, as it was also called. Paige sighed. "Well, I don't know much about it, but since it's completely out of her character," she looked at the pool, "and since there is no real trigger for it, that could only mean that, well, it might mean that." "What?" Track snapped. She shrugged. "Maybe she is shifting, more subtly, internally." The small group went quiet. Great. Now I was a dangerous freak. A vampire slash werewolf with the power to go vamp. When a full vampire vamped, our normal strength intensified. How did I know all this? It's common knowledge. Just because I never used it doesn't mean I don't know about it. Sheltered or not, I did know the basics of being a vampire. When did she eat last? Jonathan asked, looking at his expensive waterproof watch. For some reason that irritated me too. About 2 hours ago, I whispered, trying hard not to hiss. Jonathan turned and trotted over to where Martin stood by the door. I let my eyes slowly raise and looked at Track. I am so sorry, I again whispered, my chin dipping just a little. He smiled and wiggled his brows at me. I'll forgive you if, I snapped. But this time I was able to grab the anger and shove it back quickly. I let my eyes soften and forced my face to relax. If you let me pick the movie tonight, he grinned. I smiled and nodded. That was easy enough. Jonathan came back and flashed me that smile that seemed to do something odd to me internally. There now, we'll get you a thermos. It's probably nothing more than you needing to feed more often now. Paige turned her head to talk to Michael, and when I looked at her, neither of them turned away. Gads, I really need to figure this out. Get control, or Dad was going to lock me in my room and never let me out. I could do it. I knew I could. The problem was, when the pain hit, it pushed all sense and thought right out of the window. There was that voice, though. The other part of my brain that was trying to keep me sane through it. I was going to have to listen harder next time. I would find my other voice, focus on it, and see what that would do. As I was committing myself to this new goal, I felt an odd sensation. It started in my calves, of all places. Just a very small tingle almost, a little heat. Barely noticeable, but when I focused on it, I felt it start to move through me. I think I'm about to shift was all I got out, and the pain hit. I screamed as it tore me apart from the inside, rushing through me like a freight train tearing through a town. I was laid down, or fell. I didn't know and didn't care. I rolled up into a ball and started hoping this would be the end, the final time, that peace and death would finally have mercy on me. Then I heard of the voice. It buzzed somewhere, over the snapping of my bones and over the screams of my utter and complete agony. Focus, I told myself, then screamed again as my body was thrown in another position while my skeleton refused itself. The voice was a bit louder this time. Listen, it said. Ignore the pain and listen to me. I tried, but my head was slammed to the ground as my facial muscles and bones were reorganized. Listen to me now. And I did, or at least I tried. I pushed myself outside of the pain and separated myself from it. How I did it, I have no idea. It was like I stepped aside and sat in a chair, waiting while my body was thrashed and beaten. The voice talked to me as it happened. Speak, it said. Talk now. What do you want me to say? I spat through clenched teeth. What a bizarre sensation. I could feel my body being thrown back and forth, but it seemed very disconnected. I knew there was pain, but that seemed oddly elsewhere at the same time. Anything. Just talk, my mind's voice said. So I did. I rambled on aimlessly. I suddenly knew it was important to do so. Why? I couldn't say I knew. I prattled on about anything I could think of, random information, even quoted some of my favorite movie scenes just to talk. Finally, I felt a pull. I turned and felt a rush through me as I reconnected with my body. The sound swirled, the air blew in and out of my now strong lungs, and I blinked, my wolf eyes open. Crap. I forgot the don't hurt them mantra, I thought, as Track was sitting next to me. His chest was heaving, he was covered in sweat, and there were a series of gouges across his chest and one arm. But he was looking at me, and his eyes were wider than I thought they could get. What the heck is the matter now? I thought, and sure enough, his brows went higher on his forehead. I stood and shook myself hard. That always felt so darn good after shifting. Jonathan knelt down. Reina? He asked, giving me an odd look as well. Who else would it be? I chuckled, then tilted my head. Wow, he really is cute. Jonathan smiled, and I looked back at Track, suddenly connecting more dots. Can you hear me? When Track nodded slowly, I sat down hard. Seriously? He nodded again, his own eyes wide, and I wondered if wolves could blush. I blinked a few times and then turned to Jonathan. Can you hear me too? I thought. When he also nodded, I shook my head hard. How is that possible? I can only hear my other pack wolves when we're shifted. Jonathan sat down, and I noticed a large tear in his pant legs, and I saw the deep scratches across his thigh. I'm sorry, I thought. He shrugged. No need to be. So, you think I'm cute? He grinned, obviously recovering faster than Track. I snorted and looked up. My dad was jogging towards us, Paige, Michael, and the doctors with him. Oh great, when the white coats find out, they're going to want to dissect me, I growled, and Track turned. He quickly scooted closer to me, still sitting. Then maybe we shouldn't tell them, he stated, looking over at Jonathan. Jonathan frowned but nodded. For now, but you'll have to keep your thoughts to yourself. If you can? How could I do that? Not think? Track cleared his throat, and I made myself see images, like when I talked to my pack. The doctors knelt down, and sure enough, out came the needle. Ouch! I thought, and Jonathan and Track froze. But the doctors didn't seem to notice. I frowned and looked at Jonathan, who gave a small shrug. Who can hear me? I asked cautiously, my eyes taking in everyone without moving my head. Track gave a small cough. Jonathan gave a tiny nod. The three of us looked through those there. None of the others made any moves to show they heard me. So only you two can hear me? I asked, a bit braver now. The needle came out, and I growled softly at the doctor, which he also ignored. Track tilted his head, and I looked at him, then reached out with my muzzle. He peered at me, and I realized he was trying to see if I could hear him too. Sorry, can't hear a thing, I stated. He gave a small nod and straightened up as the other doctor knelt in front of him and started to clean his wounds. I shifted my focus to Jonathan, grunting as the doctor put a stethoscope between my front legs. What was different about this shifting? I asked. He looked at me and then glanced around at the others. I sighed and realized this was going to be a one-sided conversation since they couldn't let the others know they could hear me. When my mini-physical was over and my two victims were cleaned up, the doctors left. My dad talked to Paige and Michael, then knelt in front of me, said a few words, gave me a tight hug, and then left. I barely heard any of it. My mind was racing with excitement and confusion. As soon as he was gone, I turned and trotted to the shallow end of the pool, Jonathan and Track quickly following. I stepped onto the first stair, and they sat on each side of me, our back to the guards and the physical therapist. So what was different about this shift? I asked. Track shrugged, leaning forward and keeping his voice low. I don't know if anything was. I was kind of busy trying to keep you still. I looked at his chest and my eyes dropped. Does it hurt much? Only if it gets me more sympathy, he chuckled, and I playfully nipped at him. Jonathan looked at me. Did you notice anything different? I told them both everything, even about the voice. I had to tell someone, and they were both a safe bet. I didn't see either of them opting to lock me away for it. So, you're able to disconnect, Jonathan said thoughtfully, and you told yourself to talk, and keep talking. Then, when you shifted, Track and I were able to hear you. Track nodded. I thought it was just me because of our pack connection, but guess not. He shot Jonathan a look, then turned to me. Were you thinking about us when you shifted? I don't think so, I thought. I was a bit busy trying to survive. Is it always so incredibly painful? He stole a quick glance behind us to make sure the others were far enough away. Then he looked at the pool in front of us. The first few months it can be pretty bad. After that it settles down and happens so fast you don't notice it, at least for us males. Females have always had a harder time. That's why they don't shift as often. Even then, though, it's not this bad. Do you think it's just another variation of my shift? Or do you think I was able to control it somehow, so that you can hear me? I don't know, they both said at the same time. That's where I'm going to stop there.